Today, we bring you another fall swipe gaming film. Much like how John Carpenter's The Thing was a remake that actually improved upon the original, so too are we enhancing our history of one of the most iconic Generation 1 Pokemon, Starmie. And Starmie is indeed, in many ways, much like the terrifying thing from another world. Its so-called face is inscrutable. It seems to be a starfish, but it has a mysterious glowing gem in its core, and its cry in the anime isn't its own name, like most other Pokemon. Instead, when Misty first sent her Starmie out back in the 90s, we heard its now famous... In more direct connections, many Pokedex entries cite whispered rumors of Starmie being an invader from outer space, while others mention outright that it sends electric waves into outer space. It's not just a starfish. It's a starfish made from an actual star. It's like if Patrick from SpongeBob not only came from space, but had a jewel that glowed 7 different colors when not looked upon by human eyes. Can you imagine a more eldritch cosmic horror than that? And if all that wasn't enough, Starmie has repeatedly proved its hostility by relentlessly terrorizing competitive battlers ever since the first generation. We gaze upon it in fear as we ask the question we are almost too petrified to learn the answer to. How great was Starmie actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Starmie was one of the very best, most defining and metagame shaping forces from day one of competitive Pokemon. It was one of Gen 1's most well-rounded Pokemon, with excellent stats across the board, a terrific offensive and defensive move pool, the former of which was bolstered by a tremendous critical hit rate thanks to its excellent speed, and the latter included Recover, which boasted 32 PP in the first generation, and of course the coveted Psychic typing. Its partial water typing was excellent too, providing Starmie with a crucial resistance to ice and granting it the rare ability to resist Jinx's fearsome stab combination. So how did all of these traits come together in actual battles? Well, that depended on the trainer and how they wanted to use Starmie, because Starmie could do it all. It could function as an excellent lead, it absorbed sleep beautifully against Jinx because, unlike Alakazam, who had to run in fear of Jinx's mighty blizzard, Starmie could afford to stay in and burn sleep turns against it, meaning it actually had a good chance of waking up and being useful later in the game, thus potentially avoiding the pitfall of sleep effectively being a KO. Starmie was similarly effective against Exeggutor leads, except it actually threatened Eggy far more than Alakazam could, thanks to its own high-powered crit-happy blizzard. Wait, Exeggutor? Isn't that a grass type? Yeah, but its best grass stat was Mega Drain, which was incredibly weak and thus not used too often. The only time it was ever used was to stop Starmie from completely walling it, and Exeggutor generally preferred other moves like Stun Spore, Double Edge, or Hyper Beam anyway. The final sleep lead, Gengar, had to run in terror from Starmie since the odds of either getting crit KO'd by Psychic or missing Hypnosis were far too risky to start a game off. Against Alakazam, Starmie could absorb Thunder Wave effectively, which would let it block Exeggutor's sleep later in the game. Of course, Starmie didn't have to absorb a status as a lead. It worked just as well for this purpose mid-game. It just happened to be an outstanding lead. In fact, the rise in Jolteon leads came from players' search for a lead that could consistently actually threaten Starmie with any degree of safety, especially since they were tired of running into mirrors with their own Starmie lead. Of course, Starmie didn't need to absorb status, both as a lead and otherwise. As a lead especially, it became popular to bait Thunder Waves from Alakazam for its teammate Chansey to switch into, and thus become immune to sleep, and even more importantly, freeze. This leads us to another way Starmie was used to great effect. Avoiding status with bulky Pokemon like Psychic types, Chansey, and Snorlax could be quite difficult in RBY, and thus it was generally a good idea to have a Pokemon good at taking it designated for the role, as opposed to trying to have that Pokemon dance around taking it at all costs. And indeed, Starmie was one of the best status absorbers, but of course an unstatus Starmie was absolutely excellent. It didn't just have to get into extended status and recovery heavy stalemates only interrupted by Psychic special drops. It could be a terrifying threat in its own right if its health was preserved for late game. One of the main reasons for this was its outstanding matchup against the late game RBY threat, Tauros. Starmie was one of the few Pokemon faster than the Bull, alongside only Alakazam and Jolteon. And even more importantly, Starmie was the only one of those faster Pokemon that could withstand the combination of Tauros' Body Slam and Hyper Beam, crits notwithstanding, meaning that even if Starmie was paralyzed by Body Slam, it didn't cease to be a check to Tauros, especially since Tauros avoided Thunder Waves like the plague and would dominate the one-on-one afterwards. Starmie was thoroughly unique in both being able to outrun Tauros and couldn't take its hits, and in conjunction with its strong special and great coverage, it was a terrifying late-game threat, plowing through other late gamers like Rhydon and Slowbro. Even Zapdos wasn't exactly a terrible matchup for Starmie. It obviously wasn't good, but Starmie could take a Thunderbolt with ease. In fact, taking 74.6 to 87.9% from it, and its Blizzard slammed Zapdos quite hard. This Thunderbolt calc went to show just how obscenely difficult Starmie was to KO in most games. A more common but no less incredible example came in the form of Exeggutor attempting to bait in and explode on Starmie for the benefit of its teammate Tauros. It couldn't achieve this if Starmie was at full health, since even the monstrously powerful explosion topped out at 96.9%. And Starmie was all too happy to liberally spam recover to keep itself at full health, both for that Exeggutor boom and to be able to withstand the Tauros body slam and hyper beam combination. This immense hit-taking ability was another reason why Starmie was so good at taking status. It allowed it that extra turn to wake up, or the ability to withstand a hit while paralyzed and then become the faster Pokemon again. It may seem paradoxical to have such a fast Pokemon be the designated paralysis taker on a team, but Starmie's huge bulk and ability to paralyze the opponent in return, in conjunction with the utterly immense longevity of a 32 PP recover that let it continuously utilize that great bulk throughout the course of a match, meant it was excellent at doing so. Remember, in Gen 1, if both Pokemon were paralyzed, Starmie would be the faster one after all. Starmie often paired with the other recovery user in OU, Alakazam, to lend its team an outstanding blend of psychic power and longevity, and it ensured that even if one of them took status, there would still be another excellent fast psychic type unstatus and ready to threat the opposition. Speaking of status, Starmie was outstanding at spreading it onto the opposing team for the benefit of its own teammates. The aforementioned Thunder Wave was its go-to, as it guaranteed paralysis on an important target like Alakazam or Chansey, making them easier for teammates like Zapdos and Tauros to blast through. But early game, before its teammate Exeggutor or Sing Chansey had grabbed sleep, it wouldn't want to spam T-Wave, so it could effectively fish for risk-free freezes instead. All in all, Starmie was absolutely incredible in the first generation of OU. It could fit on any team in a number of roles. It was guaranteed to be useful in every single game, and the payoffs for utilizing it effectively were huge. It is difficult to overstate the importance Starmie played in RBY OU. In addition to its status as a top 6, sometimes top 5, and to some players even top 4 Pokemon, some of the best, most decorated battlers even argued that one could tell how good a player's understanding of RBY was based on how they understood Starmie's role in the metagame. You don't get much higher praise than that. Starmie also had a solid niche in RBY Ubers. Its role centered around status absorption was largely similar to that of OU, since the spreaders of Sleepers, Paralysis, and Freeze were the same, but Starmie could also switch into Mew and withstand its initial hits quite well, threatening it with Paralysis in return. Though Mew would undoubtedly win the one-on-one, Starmie helped its team dance around it. Starmie could potentially even do the same against none other than Mewtwo. Now obviously it could only do this against Mewtwo sets lacking Thunderbolt, but when you're facing something as scary as Mewtwo, you look for any little thing you can do against it, and Starmie's ability to withstand Psychic and Blizzard was invaluable against many variants, allowing it to slow Mewtwo down with Paralysis. It could also help its team stall Thunderbolt-less Mewtwo's attacking PP. It wouldn't be able to out-heal the brutal damage from a 999 special Psychic, but it also took just the right amount of damage to be able to spam recover for a bit in that all-important quest to survive Mewtwo's barrage of 16 Psychic PP. Of course, since so many Mewtwo ran Thunderbolt, this wasn't always common, and Starmie had to compete with fellow Water Psychic type Slowbro for the role of attempting to stifle Thunderbolt-less Mewtwo, since Slowbro could also boost with Amnesia, but the role was legitimate, and Starmie could really do no wrong in Generation 1. With Generation 2's addition of Spikes and Rapid Spin, Starmie's role shifted to that of a key player in the first ever Hazard metagame. Its very existence forced teams to adapt. Players hoping to simply stack their Spike and be done with it with no further plan would be eternally stifled by Starmie, since Spin had twice as much PP as Spikes. Plus, with Stab Psychic to destroy the most common, dangerous, and easy to fit and use Rapid Spin blocker Gengar, Starmie was regularly an immense thorn in the side of teams that relied on Spikes to get their offense running. Even the spiker that supposedly beat Starmie, Hidden Power Bug Fortress, was far from ironclad against it, and not only did Fortress not always want to run HP Bug, but it was also an infinitely more difficult Pokemon to use than the ever-splashable and consistent Cloyster. It wasn't easy to forcibly remove Starmie despite its pursuit weakness either. Umbreon's pursuit was quite weak and could be recovered off, while Tyranitar's threat of a full-powered Crunch didn't come close to putting the fear of a one-hit KO in Starmie either, and Starmie's Surf 2-hit KO Tyranitar back. In short, Spikes were a major part of GSC offense, and Starmie was a major part of shutting Spikes down. At first, many teams would simply accept that they wouldn't get Spikes up with their preferred Cloyster variants, many running HP Electric for massively common Cloyster mirrors, as they would simply use Cloyster to lure in and explode on Starmie. Of course, this meant that Starmie had done its job, ensure that the opposing team had not laid Spikes down. These offensive teams attempted to take advantage of Starmie not being around by using offensive threats that Starmie was used to check, usually, and most notably, Machamp, although the occasional Belly Drum Charizard could also fit the bill. However, Starmie teams were generally quite defensively sound. They preferred to play long games after all, and they liked Starmie on their teams because of its ability to deny Spikes. They would hardly instantly crumple upon losing Starmie, even against something as threatening as Machamp. Starmie's ability to deny Spikes wasn't just useful for defensive purposes either. These same teams that liked to take it slow did so not just to drag games out, but to find the perfect opportunity to set up their own defensive threats, which were among the most dangerous in the game, and which Starmie was outstanding at facilitating. Belly Drum Snorlax needed to have its own HP to set up, and Thick Club Marowak lacked the passive healing of Leftovers. Both were infinitely more terrifying without Spikes in the picture, and thus they loved Starmie as a teammate. Eventually, offensive teams found a way to exploit the passivity that Starmie teams fell into. The offensive team was easily able to force the Starmie team into patterns, since to deviate from such patterns would be making worse plays, and the offensive team took advantage. By Cloyster luring in and toxicking Starmie, even though the damage reset upon switch out, they would put Starmie on a timer that, through timely switching and threatening Starmie out, would eventually force it to allow a spike, and from there the dominoes would begin to tumble. Even though Starmie was often paired with a Heal Bell user, this didn't solve the issue. Heal Bell had a mere half of Toxic's PP, and the Heal Bell users were incredibly passive, meaning they were just another part of the predictable and thus exploitable defensive core that offensive teams now ran circles around. The defensive Starmie team could never settle into its comfortable slow pace, meaning it found it difficult to safely set up its own threats, and it would eventually lose in the long run. At first, this was attributed to a flaw on Starmie's part, that its own passivity was somehow the problem, but as Starmie teams adapted, Starmie was revealed to be quite excellent. It simply required a less passive supporting cast than before. Previously, defensive Starmie teams had eschewed Spikes, electing to utilize the Drumlax Marowak combination as their offense, especially since it was believed that Starmie competed with Spikers for a team slot. But through experimentation, it was discovered that pairing Starmie with Spikes, which put the offensive team on a timer and prevented them from double switching around forever, went an incredibly long way in evening the scales. They also used other tactics such as Thunder Snorlax to lure in and destroy Cloyster, preventing it from sticking around and continuously relaying Spikes all battle. As such, the Drumlax Marowak Starmie style slowly disappeared, giving way to the Spike Starmie stall style, which rose to become some of the most effective, even dominant team styles in the GSC metagame. Starmie's defensive profile also became more impressive over time, as it was a perfect Jinx wall, and even if frozen, its bulk and resistance to both stabs gave it plenty of time to potentially thaw out. And even if that didn't happen, it could still waste Jinx's attacking PP even while frozen, thanks to how little it took from its attacks and the passive recovery of Leftovers. So you may be wondering, why wasn't Starmie ever using offensive sets? Well, it wasn't difficult to wall Starmie at all, with Leftovers everywhere and the metagame completely dominated by the impenetrable Special Wall Snorlax, to say nothing of its common partner Raikou. However, after a long time, it was discovered that Starmie could in fact be an utterly monstrous offensive threat thanks to one move, Nightmare. This move brutally punished the ubiquitous use of Rest as a recovery tool. Suddenly, Snorlax, the Electrics, or even something like Vaporeon or Suicune could no longer sit on Starmie while Rest looping it. They were pressured and had to switch around, which led to a lot of Spikes damage. This set was so, well, nightmarish that it regularly caused immense trouble even for teams with multiple Starmie checks. What made it particularly obnoxious was the use of Substitute. This move had previously been explored as an alternative option on classic bulky Starmie, and it was quite useful. It absorbed Explosion in a one-on-one against Cloyster and Exeggutor, and it was incredibly useful for subbing in Zapdos' face, forcing it to waste valuable Thunder PP. Sub even blocked Giga Drain in in Generation 2, meaning Starmie completely dominated Exeggutor one-on-one. Substitute had all the same benefits on the offensive Nightmare set, while accentuated Starmie's capabilities of an offensive threat. It was even more difficult to switch around since now you could no longer hit it directly. It would hide behind subs, repeatedly attacking you and punishing you for trying to heal it off. It was destructive against offensive and defensive teams alike. So overall, Starmie was an incredible Pokemon in GSC OU. For the longest time, it was exclusively seen as a piece of defense, but eventually its capacity to act as a terrifying offensive threat reared its head and made its mark on the metagame. And once again, Starmie had a niche in Ubers, though it was much smaller this time around. It was harder to fit on a team since it didn't contribute much besides the Spikes War, which was usually played by more overall consistent Pokemon. Starmie did wall several obnoxious Mewtwo and Mew variants, which was nice, but it wasn't exactly a consistent Pokemon for this choice either. One could get quite a lot of mileage out of Starmie as long as they didn't over-rely on it. Spinning was great, as was its ability to reliably spread paralysis for the benefit of its teammates, and if it could wall one of the Mews, all the better. It was just not something to base your team around, for that would be taken advantage of. However, this did mark Starmie's second successful, if minor, appearance in Ubers. Starmie tore up OU once again in Generation 3. Its trajectory was the inverse of Generation 2. In advance, Starmie was first thought of exclusively as an offensive threat, and it was fairly difficult to fit on teams since EVs were no longer maxed out across the board. And Starmie was quite frail as a result, meaning it didn't bring much to a team defensively. Pokemon that could also contribute to a team's defenses while being threats were generally preferred. This was a major reason why offensively threatening but defensively limited or non-existent Pokemon like Blaziken were rarely seen in the initial stages of advance. Starmie, however, was a rare exception to this rule, because man, what an offensive threat it was. EVs no longer being maxed out across the board worked in its favor. Suddenly, a significant portion of the metagame was instantly smashed by its strong stab Hydro Pump and incredible Bolt Beam supporting coverage. It was a late game cleaning machine, outspeeding and one-hit KOing massive swaths of offensive Pokemon. Teams that stacked Dragon Dance Sweepers were utterly terrified of it, as the trio of Salamence, Tyranitar, and Gyarados were all crushed by it. So was their partner Magneton. Their other trusty partner, Metagross, was slammed hard by Hydro Pump as well, and couldn't KO Starmie back without explosion, meaning that it wouldn't be exploding on the physical wall Starmie was paired with, if the Starmie user even let the Metagross user blow up on Starmie to begin with anyway. But even if they did, it was a favorable trade. But wait, didn't these teams have their special check Snorlax? Well, yes, but Permanent Sandstorm worked in Starmie's favor. It nullified leftovers on otherwise decent checks like Snorlax, Zapdos, and Celebi, severely limiting their capacity to withstand its hits and elevating Starmie to a massive level of terror. And if Starmie was paired with Spikes, as it often was, forget it. It was absolutely lights out. In fact, Starmie eventually established itself as one of the most reliable cleaners on standard Skarm Bliss teams for its ability to come in and completely take over an endgame. These teams didn't really need much else in the way of defensive backbone, but they did need speed and power, and Starmie delivered that, especially when paired with Gengar, who loved baiting in and messing up Blissey for Starmie to take advantage of. Plus, it's not like Starmie was completely useless defensively. Despite its frailty that came with a lack of investment, Starmie could take a hit against offense too, surviving a +1 Salamence hidden power flying. All this was just done with 3 moves too. The Fort slot allowed Starmie to bring a lot to its team. Most commonly, it slotted in Rapid Spin, giving its team a much needed relief against Spikes. However, it could also go 4 attacks with Psychic, letting it plow through Gengar as well as something like Heracross, which thought it could take a hit. Finally, it could run Recover to great effect too. Despite its frailty, the longevity was valuable against bulkier teams that tried to dance around it with chip damage. It was notable for allowing Starmie to sit on Blissey for a little bit. It changed the dynamic of their one-on-one matchup a bit. If Starmie didn't have Recover, it'd have to switch out of Blissey immediately, or else it wouldn't heal off the damage it sustained from Seismic Toss. But with Recover, it could actually be quite irritating for Blissey, staying in and draining a good chunk of power points from it. And more reliably, forcing a soft boiled from Blissey, allowing for a free switch in for its teammates as opposed to having to take status for a Seismic Toss. This made its partner Tyranitar much more dangerous. Forget this Blissey talk though, not every team had one, and most of those teams that didn't have Blissey were shredded by Starmie to unparalleled degrees. Nothing limited offensive teams like Starmie did. It was a gatekeeper of ridiculous proportions. Offensive teams had better setup and win fast, or Starmie was going to blow them away. It was perhaps the single best late game threat in the tier. It was fast, required cared no setup, one-hit KO'd opposing Pokemon left and right, and could switch moves, unlike another dangerous late-game threat, Choice Band Aerodactyl. Starmie shaped the metagame so much that its increased prominence almost single-handedly changed standard Dragon Dance Tyranitar's nature from adamant to jolly, so it could outrun Starmie after a Dragon Dance. That is no joke. Eventually though, at one of the points in the metagame where spikes were utterly dominant, players came to recognize that Starmie could be quite an effective defensive Pokemon. Not only did it stick around nicely with Natural Cure and 32 PP Recover, it was also a rapid sprinter with a strong stab Psychic that destroyed the spin blocking Gengar that was absolutely everywhere. This was great on all sorts of teams, such as balance and offense, that just needed some relief from constant spikes pressure, but was most commonly used by spikes teams to gain an edge over other spiking teams. Spin Starmie Spike Stall became the most popular, dominant metagame defining team in the metagame. If your team lost to it, it was a bad team. End of story. Teams were forced to adapt to it. From maintaining the health of your specially defensive Toxic Protect Skarmory, to trapping with Dugtrio or Pursuit Crunch Tyranitar, to running specially defensive Gengar, to pivoting into Jolteon, it was all about keeping spikes up in Starmie's face. Otherwise, it would eternally shut you down. But what about matchups where the opponent didn't have spikes, you may wonder? Offensive teams were still quite prominent after all. Well, it turned out that when you give Starmie actual defensive investment, it was quite a good defensive Pokemon. Most notably, it was a great answer to Metagross, barring Explosion. And if Metagross blew up on it, it wouldn't be exploding on Starmie's teammate Swampert, meaning Swampert was still around and healthy to handle Metagross's physical attacking teammates. So all in all, it took a while to establish itself, but eventually Starmie became among the most defining Pokemon in Advance, whether on offense or defense, chalking up another generation for itself as one of OU's most elite forces. Generation 4 elevated Starmie's potential as an offensive menace, with the addition of choice specs and, more commonly, thanks to Starmie's desire to switch moves and maximize the use of its amazing coverage, Life Orb, it now had new levels of power that allowed it to slam through offensive Pokemon like Metagross with even greater efficiency, to say nothing of how its speed remained incredible and allowed it to effortlessly blast through dangerous new threats like Infernape and Garchomp. It was so dangerous offensively, many players early on didn't even bother with Rapid Spin, despite the newfound dominance of Stealth Rock. They figured Starmie was too much of a KO machine to waste turns getting rid of rocks. Indeed, much of Diamond and Pearl was played at a breakneck pace, and Starmie's primary use was being faster and stronger than the rest of the slew of the offensive threats. And though its usage did dwindle as offensive Deoxys speed, which largely outclassed it in this role, began to take over the metagame, it did see some more use after DOS was banned, particularly with choice specs. Yachtberry Garchomp was destroying the entire tier, and Starmie Specs Ice Beam was able to KO it through the berry. Garchomp was banned at the tail end of Diamond and Pearl, and Starmie didn't have much time to shift because Pokemon Platinum came around and brought with it several additions that initially overshadow it, most notably the Rotom forms and Shaman Sky. Even after Skyman's ban, Starmie was relegated to a background role. Now keep in mind, by background role, we mean genuinely good OU Pokemon, just one that wasn't as prominent as some of the newer, flashier toys in the tier. This was especially the case because Latias soon joined OU, and it usually competed for Starmie's slot. This was not to say Starmie was outclassed, far from it. Several teams made use of its unique talents, such as having a powerful Hydro Pump to blast through the Rotom appliances everyone was using to spin block, allowing Starmie to pull off rapid spins in the otherwise hazard-littered Taunt Skarmory-dominated metagame. It was just that Specs Latias Draco Meteors were a lot more instantly directly destructive, so teams preferred it. This didn't make Starmie bad at all, just harder to slot onto a team. And this is by Starmie's high standards too. Anything less than a metagame defining Titan seemed strange to it, but it was still a common sight in OU. In fact, certain balanced teams relied heavily on Starmie's hazard removing abilities, so they could go the distance with long-term bulky setup sweepers like Cursed Tyranitar, and it was excellent at doing so. Some players also enjoyed offensive Starmie as a lead. Its fast-paced, hard-hitting nature meant it would not only dish out heavy damage, potentially claiming a KO, but it would do so while dissuading early entry hazard setup thanks to Rapid Spin. Eventually, in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Latias was banned, and Starmie began to reclaim its place as a top-tier OU threat. The metagame began leaning more towards UU-esque fire, water, grass cores, with a particular interest in the already popular Infernape, now that its best check Latias had been banned. Starmie's classic Life Orb set sliced through these like butter, and also rose in usage to become one of the best, most dangerous leads. Some lead variants even began using choice specs with Psychic, which would grab an instant surprise one-hit KO on the Machamp leads that had come to completely redefine the lead metagame. It also one-hit KO'd the ever-popular Scarf Tyranitar that was switch in, expecting to live on Life Life Orb Hydro Pump. Then Salamence was banned, Heatran became the most popular Pokemon in the metagame, and well, remember how Starmie wasn't a metagame defining Titan before? Yeah, that was no longer the case. It reclaimed its place as an OU giant, famously shredding any team without a Blissey, which was many of them. Players scrambled to check it. When Starmie came in against Heatran, they resorted to lines like pivoting into offensive Suicune and then Scarf Flygon to U-turn, praying they wouldn't get obliterated on the switch. Even decent grass-type checks like Shaman and specially defensive Roserade weren't exactly safe either. Starmie often led off with Ice Beam and crushed them. This actually made Starmie an excellent partner for offensive Suicune. The latter easily picked up on the weakened remains the former left in its wake. Some unique new Pokemon came out of this Starmie smashed environment. Players who didn't want to resort to Blissey wound up using Pokemon like Abomasnow and Quagsire to stifle it. Of course, offensive wasn't the only way Starmie could roll. Its dedicated defensive Rapid Spin set began popping up on bulky Spikes teams. At this time, the metagame centered largely around the Fortress Stall teams, which had become popular in the Dragons metagame. But Starmie offered a new, more reliable alternative for keeping rocks off for its teammates, thanks to its incredible one-on-one matchup against far and away the most popular Stealth Rock user in the tier, Shuka Berry Heatran. In a dynamic reminiscent of GSC Cloyster, most teams with Shuka Heatran had no way of forcing Stealth Rock to stay up against bulky Starmie. Starmie would simply come in and spin all the livelong day. Sure, Heatran could explode and take Starmie out, but then Starmie would have accomplished its task, to prevent Stealth Rock from being set. It's not like working around Starmie was easy either. Even without investment, its Hydro Pump plowed through ghosts and pursuiters alike. Slapping Pasho Berry on Heatran was useful, but not without its drawbacks, especially with how crucial Shuka Berry was to its place in the metagame at the time. Starmie became even more difficult to deal with for Stealth Rocking Heatran when players started running bold-natured Starmie to let it shrug off Scarf Tyranitar's hits in those would-be perilous Crunch versus Pursuit games. Not only did this remove one of the most reliable ways of forcibly removing Starmie, it also made Starmie even more difficult to deal with by virtue of increasing its bulk to the point that even Heatran's explosion wouldn't take it out from full health. Scarf Tar's presence was also positive for Starmie. As a partner, it helped remove the Rotom appliances so Starmie could more easily spin. To continue the aforementioned dynamic reminiscent of GSC, Starmie Spike styles, which paired with Skarmory or Roserade for those spiking duties, rose to the forefront of the metagame and became a dominant popular team genre. Eventually, the player base caught on, and there was a massive shift in the hazard metagame. If your rocker got shut down by Starmie, like so many variants of Heatran did, then you needed to have some sort of support network to remove it, or you'd be up the creek without a paddle. Though of course not always possible, it was generally helpful to have a Stealth Rocker with a positive matchup against Starmie, so you could actually utilize Rock's pressure and not instantly have to deal with Starmie coming in and removing them. Stealth Rock Jirachi and Tyranitar began increasing in popularity for this reason. There were even quite a few instances of less common but still effective Stealth Rockers like Empoleon and Celebi. However, this hardly slowed Starmie down at all. It had fully taken over the metagame. There were many players who almost literally couldn't not use Starmie. They relied, or rather over-relied, on Starmie to keep hazards off, which resulted in many Starmie being thrown away almost for nothing. Some attributed this to Starmie having a weaker place in the metagame, but this was proven to be a mistake, as demonstrated by Starmie's continuous immense success when utilized with greater precision and restraint, to say nothing of its staggering astronomical usage rate. All this was just in regards to defensive Starmie too. Offensive Starmie had shifted away from the oft-abused recoil of Life Orb, but it remained an incredible offensive threat, just with leftovers. Perhaps even more of a threat since one could no longer play around it with chip damage nearly as easily. In addition to being massively challenging for most offense to switch into, Starmie also effortlessly used the pressure it exerted to get rapid spins off the benefits of dangerous Stealth Rock teammates like Zapdos and Dragonite. Here is the single best example of how an oppressive and offensive force Starmie was. For an incredibly long time, the most popular item on the support Tyranitar that had become an offensive staple, and by a significant margin at that, was Pasho Berry. This was almost exclusively for Starmie. Yeah, it helped against Agility and Empoleon, and could also help against Gyarados, and it didn't hurt to have an offensive Suicune insurance, but those weren't the reasons it was the unequivocal best, most popular item on this T-Tar set. No, the one reason was that it allowed T-Tar to not get completely destroyed while switching into the brutally threatening Starmie, because almost nothing else could. Eventually, Starmie's stranglehold on the metagame loosened. Why? In short, Clefable. Clefable provided an excellent, resilient answer to Starmie, surviving even 2 Life Orb Hydro Pumps, as did a partner Pokemon Clefable was often seen with, especially defensive Jirachi, which rose in popularity as an effective answer to many of the offensive teams Starmie anchored. However, Clefable did more than that. It also gave rise to a new form of stall team. Starmie stalls were all about winning the hazard war so they could remove hazards. Clefable stalls largely ignored hazards altogether. This increased resilience removed the need for Starmie's hazard removing talents on stall teams, and this made them massively difficult to deal with. As good as Starmie was, over-reliance on it could be exploited, but Clefable teams had no such problems. Starmie of course remained a key force on offensive teams, even if on its own it wasn't much of a threat. Its ability to remove hazards for massive threats like Mixed Dragonite and Infernape that threatened these stall teams was still invaluable. However, what took this concept to the next level was the reintroduction of Latias to the metagame, which reinforced stall teams that ignored hazards outright and provided more direct offensive competition through its ever-dangerous spec set. Of course, Starmie was once again far from outclassed, but it did increase its first dip in popularity in a long time. Until Choice Spec Starmie returned with a vengeance to remind the player base that it was more than just a rapid spin machine. It was a force to be reckoned with. Not only were Clefable and bulky Jirachi unable to withstand repeated specs Hydro Pumps, they were also completely ruined by Trick, which gave Starmie the freedom to, you guessed it, spin. Sure, defensive Latias and a newly returned Quagsire could take Hydro Pumps quite well, but they were also completely neutered by Trick. Sometimes Starmie didn't even run spin on specs either. It just blasted the metagame apart with Hydro Pumps and coverage, since it could of course also shred bulky Latias with Ice Beam. It wasn't just relegated to running specs either. Bulky sets spreading paralysis with Thunder Wave regained some former glory through their facilitation of dangerous slow threats like Substitute Machamp and even Rhyperior. So all in all, Starmie's influence on Generation 4 truly cannot be overstated. It was one of the most outstanding defining Pokemon in the tier, forcefully twisting the metagame into its preferred shape. The newfound existence of Ferrothorn in Generation 5 was a blow to all water types, and almost none more than Starmie. Finally, here was a perfect counter to it, and what's more, it wasn't Blissey, which at least was generally relegated to hard stall teams. No, Ferrothorn was one of the most ridiculously splashable Pokemon of all time, able to fit on just about any team. For Arceus' sake, Ferrothorn's Iron Barbs even punished Starmie for using Rapid Spin. As if that wasn't enough, Rotom Wash becoming a water and electric type also added an excellent splashable new check to Starmie. However, early whispers of Starmie no longer being threatening and a downright hearsay of suggesting it might fall to UU quickly faded into nothingness, as Gen 5 also brought another addition that catapulted it into a new realm of terror, Politoed gaining Drizzle. Starmie's already dangerous Hydro Pumps now effortlessly slice through offensive resist and specially defensive neutral targets, while threatening to overwhelm even bulkier resist over time. Yes, even Ferrothorn if played well. And as if that wasn't enough, Rain allowed it to run Thunder over Thunderbolt, making its coverage even stronger. Capping all of this off was its potential to run defensive hitting Psyshock. Like Thunder, it slammed many variants of Rotom Wash, but Psyshock also meant even Blissey was potentially ruined. Starmie's main issue was that it was a water-type rapid spinner for Rain teams, but there were several competitions in this role, with the immortal Rain Dish Tentacruel, which had established itself as one of the most obnoxious components of Rain teams. Still, Starmie saw plenty of use on Rain teams, distinguishing itself from Tentacruel not just by being a massive offensive threat, but by being a fast offensive threat. Generation 5 was filled to the brim with threats that were also naturally speedy. Garchomp, Terrakion, Latios, Thundurus, and Starmie outran and destroyed all of them. This was absolutely enormous in Slugfest where KOs were traded every other turn, with one massive threat taking a KO, then either being KO'd or forced out by an opposing massive threat that was faster. Starmie gave a huge edge since it outsped such monsters without needing to resort to Choice Scarf, which meant it was much more difficult to A, switch into, and B, exploit. It really was a monstrous offensive Pokemon too. Even the mighty Ferrothorn struggled to withstand repeated Life Orb Hydro Pumps in Rain, especially in conjunction with A, the many other hits Ferrothorn was tasked with taking, leaving it vulnerable to be overloaded by the dangerous offensive combinations Starmie was a key part of, and B, the spikes that Starmie's own partner Ferrothorn would lay. Those easily laid spikes and their excellent hype synergy actually meant Ferrothorn's existence was beneficial to Starmie. Not only did they switch in on each other's weaknesses, but Ferrothorn's spikes made it much harder for Pokemon like Tyranitar and Jirachi to stay out of range of Starmie's Hydro Pump. Now, as threatening as Starmie was, it was thought to only really be an offensive Pokemon, and its rapid spinning somewhat of an afterthought. A dedicated defensive rapid spinner was largely overlooked, until the premier rapid spinner on sand teams, Excadrill, was banned, and players started looking for alternatives. alternatives. As it turned out, good old bulky Starmie was quite excellent. But what about Ferrothorn, you ask? Well, that's where another new Generation 5 tool came in handy: Scald. Once Starmie got that inevitable Scald burn on Ferrothorn, it would be able to outlast and rapid spin easily. Scald's hefty burn rate also ensured that Tyranitar would be unable to switch in to pursue it safely, and was generally a pain for other switch-ins like Rotom Wash. Once again, Starmie quickly became a staple of many styles of Sand Stall. It almost single-handedly invalidated Rain Stall as a style. Thanks to Natural Cure and Recover, Rain Stall could barely scratch it, and it would effortlessly deny their hazards once Ferrothorn was burned. That is, for those Rain Stalls that ran Ferrothorn to begin with, the Starmie variants were completely helpless from the get-go. Starmie completely sat on these teams and was a major contributing factor to their slow disappearance from the metagame. Rain Stall faded and Sand Stall came to dominate, largely thanks to the latter employing Starmie to dominate the former. Then Black and White 2 came around and Starmie gained its Dream World ability, Analytic. At first, the ability seemed counterintuitive, since it required its user to move second on a turn in order to get the boost. Not exactly an ability befitting a fast, frail Pokemon like Starmie. However, it was soon discovered that the boost also applied if the opponent switched out, and since Starmie forced so many switches, lest it be given a free KO, Analytic wound up being a perfect ability for it. This extra burst of power on top of Life Orb or Choice Specs made Starmie even more challenging to switch into, especially in Rain. Even a healthy Ferrothorn struggled to keep up with it. It was no longer just Rain that liked Life Orb Starmie either. Offensive teams, both Sand and Weatherless, made terrific use of its beautiful combination of destruction, rapid spin, and ability to check the massively dangerous Black and White 2 newcomer, Keldeo. Indeed, being one of the few Pokemon capable of at all checking Keldeo, in conjunction with the continued importance of hazard removal, meant that bulky Starmie continued to go strong well into Black and White 2. Eventually, however, the metagame shifted more towards Magic Guard spam, whose supporting cast included Pokemon like Gliscor and Skarmory. In short, entire teams who ignored hazards rather than needing them to be removed. As such, bulky Starmie's niche wasn't necessary on Sandstall, and to make matters worse, it was generally dead weight against these teams, which loved tactics like Jellicent in conjunction with Scarf Tyranitar to ensure that Starmie would never ever spin. As such, bulky Starmie completely dropped out of the metagame. Offensive Starmie continued to be a staple on Weatherless offense, as it was utterly essential to the functioning of Stealth Rock weak monsters Volcarona and Dragonite, but it wasn't plagued by similar issues. It boiled down to the following: in Gen 5 OU, you would not spin if your opponent didn't want you to. The other spinners were bad, and Starmie was the only decent one, and it still was stifled by the common hazard setups. You could make all the jokes about tricking Ring Target onto Jellicent and getting that spin off that you wanted, as not only would you be running a bad set, you would still be forcibly removed by Scarf Tyranitar, and then hazards would instantly go back up, and Starmie would have accomplished nothing, and you were essentially playing 5v6 with a team that needed Stealth Rock removed but couldn't do so. Nobody actually wasted their time with Ring Target. Anyway, if you used Starmie, you pretty much hoped you didn't face Jellicent and its Magic Guard friends. If that was the case, it did its job well, but with the increased prominence of such teams, this proved to be a risky proposition. This was the impetus behind Excadrill's unban, and indeed Excadrill's presence discouraging Jellicent usage indirectly made Starmie a more effective spinner, though it was still not without fault. It fit well on Weatherless offense teams by virtue of their very nature. High risk, high reward. It ceased to be a threat and effectively became little more than a spinning machine that also prevented automatic losses to Keldeo. In this vein, players began using oddball tricks like Air Balloon on it to increase its efficacy in this role, giving the frail Starmie switch-in opportunities against the tier's many powerful earthquakes, maximizing its ability to get on the field to get that all-important spin-off. Starmie's role in this tier was effectively reduced to that of a Weatherless offensive facilitator, a supporting Pokemon rather than the threat it had once been, in addition to the support it had offered. But that was more of a reflection of the player base than of its true viability, as a few players demonstrated its excellence with Choice Specs in Rain. The trick wasn't to use it to compete with Tentacruel, as Tentacruel's sturdiness and reliability had eventually solidified it at a 100% required choice on Rain. Instead, Starmie was to be used alongside Tentacruel, not as a spinner, but just as an all-out offensive threat, in the same vein as a Keldeo or something. A fully unleashed spec Starmie in Rain without any thoughts or need to spin was terrifying. The set didn't take off, but when it did appear, it was extraordinary, whether it was ruining Gastrodon with Trick or hydro pumping pretty much everything else. So all in all, Starmie had a tumultuous relationship with the ever-fluctuating, hostile Generation 5 OU metagame, but time and time again, it proved itself an essential defining piece of the tier. It finally happened in Generation 6. Starmie, the eternal OU Titan, dropped to UU. And it wasn't hard to see why. Early XY wasn't at all hospitable to it. Everyone was enamored with the new hazard removing option, Defog, and the newly added Aegislash was the most perfect anti-Starmie spin blocker possible. Plus, as far as offensive water types went, there was absolutely no way Starmie could compete with the far faster, far stronger Greninja. As such, Starmie made its first appearance in UU, and there it was unsurprisingly excellent. As usual, it picked between its offensive and defensive sets, depending on the team it was being slotted into. Offensive teams loved its blend of tearing through the opposition with analytic life orb attacks from a tremendous speed tier, while defensive teams loved the ability to check opposing Pokemon and provide hazard support. Spin was strangely slept on for a while, but those who used Starmie were able to reap the full benefits of clearing opposing hazards without getting rid of their own. This was immensely useful in conjunction with bulky Starmie's most common teammates, Spike's Roserade and Mega Aerodactyl. Offensive Starmie had some competition as an offensive water-type rapid spinner with Mega Blastoise, who was much stronger and bulkier, but Starmie's higher speed giving it the jump on fire-type threats the water-type slot would have liked to have checked, such as Infernape and Entei, as well as not taking up its team's Mega slot, was a significant set of advantages that made it easier to slap on teams. Both variants of Starmie were immensely consistent and a significant piece of XYUU, and it continued in this vein when Oraz came around. Bulky Starmie was an especially crucial piece of the backbone of the sand teams that came to dominate the metagame. It helped them withstand opposing assaults, both direct and hazardous, and wore down the opposing team with its ever-irritating Scald as well as Toxic, allowing for prime conditions for Stoutland to clean up late game. However, Starmie's time in UU wouldn't be much longer, for the OU player base was beginning to notice its talents again. Aegislash had been banned in XY, so that was one of the previous problems gone. Greninja had been banned early in Oraz, so that was another. Starmie rose in OU for several reasons. One, Keldeo was continuously establishing itself as one of the tier's most annoying Pokemon, and anything that could check it was good, especially since Natural Cure meant Starmie wasn't permanently crippled if Keldeo got the Scald burn. Two, yes, Defog existed, but as players had been discovering, the Defoggers were, in most cases, not good, so more anti-hazard support was needed. Three, with the discovery of Defog's users not being so great, spike stacking had become more prominent. Not only could Starmie's spin help deal with opposing spikes, but it could do so without removing its own team spikes. And while checking Keldeo, this was a great Pokemon to have on your side. As such, bulky Starmie began seeing use and eventually established itself as a legitimate piece of the tier, as evidenced by its rise in usage that made it a genuine OU Pokemon. It began shaping the metagame. Keldeo began using Hidden Power Grass not just for it, but in large part thanks to it, whereas Stealth Rockers needed to be able to bust past Starmie somehow. Most notably, the days of running Rock's Heat Ram with no anti-Starmie plan were decidedly over, which was significant considering how popular such teams had been before. Over time, aggressive hyper-offense teams utilizing its strategies like Focus Sash Breloom, Volcarona, and/or Mega Charizard X needed fast-paced, reliable hazard removal that wouldn't remove their own Stealth Rock, and as such, they enlisted the good old analytic Life Orb Starmie of old to great results. Starmie was back and a defining piece of OU once more. It reliably enabled all sorts of Stealth Rock weak Pokemon, from Talonflame to Kyurem Black. Hyper offense with Starmie became more and more niche, and the offensive set eventually faded from regular uses. But the bulky variant kept trucking on, until once again, the metagame shifted to a more hazard immune state, meaning Starmie's spinning duties were no longer needed, while also not being useful against these teams, which utilize aggressive methods to preserve their own hazards. Once again, the combination of Jellicent and Scarf Tyranitar was popular. As such, Starmie took a backseat in OU once again, but this time it was not entirely without niche, but it had the hardest time fitting on teams yet. That said, the Forgotten Starmie is the deadliest, and just when teams thought bulky Starmie had completely vanished, it reappeared, reliably removing rocks and supporting Talonflame in the wave of anti-hyper offense that washed over the tier in the wake of brutal chains of setup sweepers that had reshaped the metagame from its slow, hazard immune state prior. Starmie's viability was in part an example of the cyclical nature of volatile, high-power metagames, as in this state it was excellent once again. So all in all, Generation 6 was another excellent one for Starmie, as despite its first foray into UU, it wound up being a defining, shaping piece of OU once more. Jellicent would be nearly non-existent if it had not been for Starmie's incredible influence. With Greninja returning to OU in Generation 7, packing not just Protean, but also Battle Bond this time, and not winding up Band, there was really no chance for Starmie to be OU, especially with the increased distribution of the fog, meaning its spinning abilities were less needed than ever. Now, some players experimented with it on stall teams late into Ultra Sun and Moon, but it was a gimmick, so make no mistake, Gen 7 Starmie's home was UU. There, however, it was excellent. Once again, it ran two different variants of Rapid Spin, offensive and defensive, for use on corresponding styles of teams. Its primary issue was how much competition it had. The similarly typed Latias was one of the very best Pokemon in the tier, while there were many other excellent water types both offensive and defensive in Primarina, Mega Sharpedo, Alomomola, Empoleon, and Tentacruel. However, as always, Starmie differentiated itself. Its greatest trait was its outstanding speed. It was the fastest non-Mega Pokemon in the tier, which vaulted it above Pokemon already considered fast, such as Latias, Gengar, Terrakion, and Infernape. This was key in not just being able to attack more, but in being able to spin more, allowing it to be as efficient as possible in supporting excellent Stealth Rock weak Pokemon like Togekiss, Rotom Heat, Kyurem, and Mega Aerodactyl. Of course, being able to attack more was not to be underestimated. Starmie's Life Orb variant possessed fierce offenses capable of dismantling much of the UU metagame, especially against frailer offensive teams. This is not to say Starmie could only threaten teams without bulk either. Quite the contrary. It possessed the capacity to crush pretty much every wall in UU that you would think could take an offensive water type in some form, from Amoonguss to Alomomola. Even the mighty Blissey didn't relish the prospect of analytic Life Orb Psyshocks. With Stealth Rock up to take its damage thresholds on a quick trip down the highway to the danger zone, Starmie was an absolute menace. In fact, it was so threatening that some players decided not to run Rapid Spin at all. This wasn't much of a problem if one's team wasn't overly bothered by rocks, which wasn't hard to do given how many threats were neutral to them, and the benefits of running another coverage move were enormous, removing one of the few ways of not at least losing a Pokemon to Starmie. Starmie wasn't required to run Life Orb to be a threat or generally useful either. It was excellent at using Colbur Berry to completely flip its matchup against its most common would-be pursuit trapper, the popular Choice Scarf Crocodile. And with analytic and special attack investment, it still hit hard. The defensive set was similarly apt at avoiding pursuit if it chose to, running Protect, which also came with the incredible benefit of scouting the intentions of another common Starmie answer, Choice Scarf Hydreigon. Bulky Starmie was also excellent because it was a spinner that could switch into the otherwise largely irritating, consistent Stealth Rock Mega Aggron and remove its rocks without fear. Whichever route it took, Starmie was an excellent consistent piece of the UU metagame, both facilitating its teammates and being a terrific performer in its own right. While in recent years, Game Freak loves to design Pokemon suited especially for doubles, Starmie might be the most singles-oriented Pokemon of all time. It's incredible that such a singles powerhouse could be so limited in VGC. While Starmie boasts a good speed tier and amazing single target coverage, that's all it has. With 2 Pokemon on the field and only 4 Pokemon per team, the archetype of revenge killers is much less powerful, because even if Starmie removes a Pokemon, it has another threat to face down afterwards that can likely take advantage of its low defenses. Bolt Beam might be great, but Starmie would really love a spread move. Even its ability is hampered, since the prevalence of Protect makes it much less likely to go off. Starmie either loses out on power, utility, or bulk in comparison to other special attackers and water types. What's more, that psychic typing really isn't doing it any favors. It's really just adding weaknesses. Here are Starmie's only notable placements. All of them leaned into 2 things that set Starmie apart, its coverage and its speed tier. This is most exemplified by Andy Brophy's 4th place finish at the Australian Nationals in 2014. Andy knew Life Orb was mandatory to exploit Starmie's coverage, and the recoil didn't mean much since Starmie was such a glass cannon anyways. Starmie might not be picking up clean KOs, so Andy would frequently lead with the pure disruption combo of Scrafty and Klefki, who would soften targets up. At that point, the unmatched combo of Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, and Scald could clean up, and Starmie was able to outrun major threats like Charizard Y and Mega Mawile. It's a nice little star for Starmie, who, without major switch-ups, is not likely to ever have a constellation of VGC victories. Starmie literally disappeared at the beginning of the generation, snapped into non-being by Dexit, but it returned in a moment of obligatory fan service with the Isle of Armor. Just kidding, mostly. Anyway, Starmie's role was different in Generation 8. On one hand, Rapid Spin had been buffed. The 50 base power wasn't really important for something like Starmie, which had such low attack, but the fact that it provided a +1 speed boost meant that Starmie could potentially use it to outrun Scarfers and clean teams up late game. This was potentially even more significant than Spin's hazard clearing capabilities, as the addition addition of heavy-duty boots meant Pokemon no longer needed their teammate to clear their hazards for them. Not that doing so wasn't welcome, of course, since there were plenty of other valuable items to be held. That said, since Rapid Spin's team support wasn't that necessary and Starmie was already so fast, it often didn't even include the move on its set, which served to make it even more of an offensive menace. Another significant difference in Generation 8 was the removal of Pursuit, meaning the removal of one of the most common methods of dealing with Starmie. It settled into UU once again, and went back to doing what it had been doing best in the same tier of the generation prior, shredding through teams with its tremendous offense. At the time of Starmie's reintroduction, UU was dominated by Noivern, Incineroar, Cobalion, Zarude, and Slowbro, both Cantonian and Galarian. These 5 made for a core so effective that they could more or less be thrown on any team with any given ground type occupying the last slot, and good results were essentially guaranteed. As a result of this ease and efficacy, this very strategy was quite common. What was particularly fun about this was that those 5 Pokemon, in conjunction with most ground types, were torn to shreds by Starmie. It was an utterly ferocious wall breaker, with few Pokemon possessing the capacity to switch into it at all safely. Especially defensive Sylveon did a decent job, and Rotom Wash was a fine interim check, but neither were guaranteed, and it was pretty much them or Chansey if you wanted any degree of safety against Starmie. Pretty much everything else was going to need to do a merry little dance and pray while doing it to avoid being ripped into ribbons by Starmie's fierce attacks, especially thanks to its absolutely incredible speed tier. It blitzed past Pokemon considered speedy like Keldeo, Terrakion, Zarude, and Obstagoon. Pretty much everything really, short of Noivern, Rabombi, and Choice Scarfers. That was it, and none of those faster Pokemon switched in safely, while most slower Pokemon risked getting destroyed by one of Starmie's attacks. Facing it was a terrifying proposition. It only needed Hydro Pump, Thunderbolt, and Ice Beam to do so too, meaning it could fit Recover in the last slot and heal off Life Orb recoil on a forced switch. Forget playing around it by forcing chip damage. To make things even better, Starmie fit on more balanced and defensive teams too, as it was still an excellent bulky spinner thanks to its amazing matchups against 2 of the most common stealth rockers, Cobalion and Mudsdale. Then the Crown Tundra came around and history was made, as for the first time ever, former perennial OU Starmie dropped below UU, landing in not RU, but all the way down in NU. RBY players everywhere shed a tear. However, this did not mean Starmie was bad in UU and RU. This was a paradoxical case of usage-based tiering anomaly, as it was and continues to be quite good in those tiers. It was particularly strange because the NU Starmie was considered better in UU than many Pokemon that are UU by usage, like Tapu Bulu, Crawdon, and Lycanroc Dusk. This is in part thanks to Starmie's incredible speed, which remains as valuable as ever. In addition to continuously getting the jump on Pokemon from the previous iteration of the tier, like Keldeo, Cobalion, and Zarude, Starmie also critically outruns Thundurus, Therian, and Salamence. Boasting this further is Starmie's surprising capacity to switch into some of these threats. That fighting resist goes a long way, and it exploits a Salamence who is forced to roost like little else. The list of Pokemon that naturally outspeed Starmie is limited to Crobat and Noivern, while Scarfers such as Diggersby and Hydreigon can do so as well, and they have U-turn. But note how none of these Pokemon want to actually switch into Starmie at all. This allows Starmie plenty of opportunity to rip through the tier with its powerful attacks, whose coverage gives it crucial advantage over Keldeo. It let it rip through would-be checks like Slowking, Amoonguss, and Primarina that would stifle Keldeo hard. As a result, Starmie is an excellent UU Pokemon despite its NU status. What about RU though? Well, if Starmie was great in UU, and it was, then it was an absolute star in RU. No, we're not sorry. We made it this far in the video without making such a pun. We earned this. Anyways, Starmie's outstanding matchup against a plethora of the tier's entry hazard setters lets it bring its old bulky spin set back to great effect. It dominates the likes of Registeel, Rhyperior, Steelix, Bronzong, and Diancie. It would likely be great even if it could only run Scald, Rapid Spin, and Recover, but its 4th move slot makes it even better. It can run either Side Shock to dominate Roserade one-on-one, or it can run a buff Teleport to get its teammates in safely. This is incredible for wall-breaking teammates like Heracross, Circuitry, and Chandelure. Yeah, Starmie with the switch move, and it's in RU. Pokemon is truly baffling sometimes. Starmie's defensive capabilities aren't just limited to entry hazards either. Its bulk, typing, and speed also help it answer or help dance around a litany of threats like Nidoqueen, Metagross, Lucario, Flygon, Beware, and Tornadus. Of course, offensive Starmie also terrorizes RU whenever it appears. It takes its UU set, exchanges Thunderbolt for Grass Knot in order to destroy the Gastrodon that would otherwise wall it, and then rips through the rest of the tier, slamming common bulky Pokemon like Incineroar. So no matter what Starmie does, it's a force in RU. Funnily enough, Starmie's worst appearance in Generation 8 is an NU. Putting aside the utterly bizarre concept of Starmie being an NU, you know, the Pokemon that formerly clashed with Gen 1 Mewtwo and RBY Ubers, now all the way down here. But then again, the same can be said for another NU staple, Snorlax. Speaking of Lax, NU is dominated dominated by incredibly bulky balance teams, featuring Pokemon like Sylveon, Vaporeon, Copperajah, Snorlax, Scrafty, Decidueye, and Serena, that are in large part characterized by their love of passing Wish around. This immense longevity means Starmie struggles to break through them. It isn't just slower Pokemon that get on Starmie's case in NU either. The prominence of faster Pokemon like Talonflame, Salazzle, and Choice Scarf Rotomo is particularly irritating. However, in spite of all this, Starmie continues to, maybe not excel, but to hold a legitimately good place in the tier. Against offensive teams, it is downright terrifying. It effortlessly rips through staples like Mudsdale, Savali Ground, Golurk, Alolan Exeggutor, Toxicroak, and Machamp. Furthermore, its speed remains terrific, letting it act as an effective offensive check to threats like Tauros and Heliolisk, ensuring it will always have some utility, some opportunity on a game-to-game basis. So despite its inconsistency relative to its usual high standards, Starmie remains a powerful performer in NU. And that's it. So how great was Starmie actually? Well, to call it great almost seems insufficient. Here we have a Pokemon that completely shaped, defined, and impacted the OU metagame for its first 6 generations of existence, never even dipping into UU until the 6th gen. And when it finally did appear in the lower tiers, it excelled in those too. It's even had 2 appearances in Ubers, in which it helped stave off none other than Gen 1 Mewtwo itself. Starmie's iconic typing, speed, rapid spin, and immense threat level, characterized by its beautiful, eternally threatening combination of Stab, Hydro Pump, and Bolt Beam, have shaped the game of Pokemon itself ever since the mid-1990s. And with that, Starmie is unquestionably one of the greatest Pokemon of all time. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you like the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Starmie? What would you give it to make it OU again? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.